Um,
Are we
hello,
ready?
hello, students, and everyone here. Welcome to Ask a Curator, or everything you wanted to ask a curator but were afraid to. um, I have like a panel here of people um, who have all done some sort of curating, but out of the group in many different ways, and also done a lot of arts administration work under the belts of the people here, and also a lot of work as studio artists in some cases. So I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves and talk about what kind of curating they've done, just really briefly. Um, as you know, I'm Danny. I'm an artist, but I've also curated for Acre and for Chicago Artists Coalition. And I've run two apartment galleries in the past 8 years. One called Adler and Floyd, which I run now, and one called Ballroom Projects. And I'm also currently the exhibitions director for Acre.
Mhm.
Anyone can jump.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Cook. I am currently a curatorial fellow with Acre Projects as well as a curatorial resident with Chicago Artists Coalition. I also run Anna's, which is a project space in East Pilsen that focuses on collaborative projects as well as a collaborative small-scale residency.
I'll follow up. Hi, everyone. My name's Alden Burke. I also run Anna's with Stephanie. In terms of sort of curatorial background, I went to SEIC for art history, sort of thinking that I was going to go into this traditional sort of curatorial landscape, but quickly found with a lot of the people that I interacted with, many people in this call, it really sort of expanded my understanding of what curation can be and how it is a creative practice. And really thinking about how to fold in collaborative efforts into what curation could look like for me. So excited to be on the call with all of you. And I will pass it to Sarita.
Hey, I'm Sarita Hernández. I am a curatorial fellow for Acre. It's my first year, so it's really exciting. And I'm like pretty non-traditional when it comes to like curating. I've jumped around from like DIY spaces, like punky sort of space, to like working in a national museum. And then I'm one of the founders of Marimacha Monarca Press, which is a queer and trans people of color print and zine collective. So I'm also a zine and printmaker and pie maker. I've been part of this group called Asociación Comunitaria de Conciencia Descentralizada, and it's basically like a lot of artists like doing oral history work in Chicago, mainly in like the Latinx community. And so a lot of my work does like definitely tap into like looking at moments in history and like seeing how artists react to that, or just being little social documentarians of a moment. Mm-hmm. Kate, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I'm like just waiting and listening. I'm Jade Bowen. I'm the executive director of Acre, and I think similarly to you, Sarita, I've kind of been in both, like it's organizing and curating and being a part of making different kinds of things happen inside of like the arts has been a thing I've been doing for a long time, and that's gone from different kinds of DIY things to institutional projects and programs. I really like to, I think a lot about like curation or this kind of production and making as like a part of the work that is important to like helping build and sustain like healthy arts communities and artists, and like all the things that we sort of need, primarily being each other, to do that kind of work. So I also work for the Museum of Contemporary Photography, where I run a screening series there, and then I was also the exhibitions director for Acre, so I've done a lot of curating for that organization as well, and then just like independently all over the place, other kind of things. But yeah, excited. And Sarita does make beautiful pies. I can-
Eyes, wow.
They're super gorgeous. I haven't gotten to tell you that yet.
I'll go. I'm
Hi,
Teresa
my name's
Silva.
Adia.
Sorry,
there's
sorry.
a lag.
Do you want to go, Adia?
No, I want to hear about Teresa first.
I want to see Zora.
She's, yeah, we'll get to that. But you can go,
Zora's
Teresa.
not hanging out.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm Teresa Silva. I am Director of Exhibitions and Residencies at the Chicago Artist Coalition. So I'm actually very happy to see a few residents, staff members from CAC on this call. In a way, what Kate was talking about, I didn't realize until a couple years ago when I was invited by the Alliance of Artist Communities to talk about curating cohorts, which is something that I hadn't seen, but then realized with admitting artists and curators to our residency programs, it really is thinking about putting together or taking care of, in a thoughtful way, putting together residents that will work together for a year or a year and a half. As an independent curator, I have, as a grad student, I worked at a historic house museum. I have a great love for history. That was a great way for me to incorporate history, artifacts, living dead artists. But I do a lot of independent curating. The last couple of projects I've done most recently is at the Chicago Cultural Center, which is closed because of COVID, which is a solo show with Luis Sagun. And we're trying to figure that out now as being a curator, how to be innovative about how do you share a show that is not open to the public. And before that, I co-curated a show that for me was also very potent to what I used to do, which was a connection between history and contemporary artists, which was living architecture at 618 North. Yeah, so those are the most recent projects that I've done, but I also do write short pieces, and yeah, that's what I do.
Hi, my name is Adia Sykes. I actually had my first taste of curating in ethnographic collections before going to graduate school at SAIC and, working in Sullivan galleries, and then moving on from there to projects like Acre. Right now, I do work independently as a curator, cultivating my own practice that centers things like intuition, improvisation, and curatorial practice as care and healing, as in healing practice. I also just recently started working for a really interesting hybrid model of contemporary art museum and hotel called 21C that's new to Chicago. And so also figuring out how to bring those practices that are more scrappy as an independent curator into not only an institutional space, but a hybrid institutional space. So working on a lot of kind of existential questions that I'm excited to be in a group of really big brains to maybe think about what it is curating. That leaves one more, Jesse.
My name is Jesse Malmed, and I'm an artist and educator and curator, and a lot of the curatorial work that I do started kind of initially from DIY spaces, and in particular kind of like non-object oriented ones, so like booking shows or whatever in high school and like making zines and making publications turned into a thing where I've done a lot of work in like screening and performance spaces. And then over the last not so long now, as I continue to age at the same rate as everybody else, I like increasingly more kind of like objects, but frequently also in some sort of form where there are always strictures in the kind of curatorial work that anybody does, but with those sort of being forefronted maybe. So things that kind of like engage somewhere between a curatorial practice and one that's like a platformist one. So among those are Trunk Show, which is something that I co-organized, which was a artist bumper sticker project, and Western Pole, which is a now almost 5-year-old pole. The pole's probably older than that, but demarcated as an art space around 5 years with different artists putting 8.5 by 11 pieces up in a sort of a pro bono public art situation. And then also do things with the Nightingale and other screening spaces. And then right before this all started, had started a new space that I was very excited about. And the sort of premise with that, I will say now publicly for the first time, was that every exhibition was, in addition to being a different show, was also a different gallery. And so the physically the same space had a different website, ethos, history behind it, rhetoric behind it. And so it's a shame that right now, after between 2 and 5 shows, depending on how you count, things that both exist and don't exist, it's like shuttered. So it's sort of a moment of like ramping up, and now feels like it's just there for dust collectors of the future. Yeah, but so that, like many other things, is sort of like an experiment in, or like the idea with that was sort of like gallery as form and exhibition making as like the sort of the central creative practice.
Thank you all. So I'm going to start with the questions, and you know, we can free form it. Anyone can step in or answer the question or not, whatever you feel. So I have written down here in my book. But a good one to start with is, how did you decide you wanted to be a curator, and what do you think it takes to be a curator?
Tiny question. Cool.
Yeah.
Good start.
Yeah, tiny question.
I could say that I had no plans to be a curator and didn't like think that that was the thing that I was going to be doing, or didn't go to school to do this, didn't like, I think the first time that I had a thought about it was probably after grad school at some point, where I was I started to maybe when I was started to work with Acre. I was one of the first curatorial fellows at Acre when they were trying to figure out what that looked like to have curators, and I thought that it was an interesting way. It's always been a really interesting way to engage in like questions about like kind of what an interesting way to learn about your own sort of practice and space and the things that you kind of do inside of an arts community, or inside of art as an artist, was to like be a part of a conversation with other artists. And it felt like a really good access point to just like having those conversations, was to start to curate programs and shows. It was just like, can we get into a conversation together? And that's really like where I came at it from. But I didn't have any plans to do that. So I think for me, there's always this thing which is just like, just show up to everything and try to say hi to everyone, and see if you can't get yourself into a pickup meeting or two, or like see if you can't get it. I feel like curating is really this thing that was about being a part of a conversation, and a lot of getting into it is just kind of showing up, and starting to sort of like start those conversations, or ask questions of each other, or see what people need, and then like find those spaces to like, if you can provide that. I don't know, does that make any sense? That's sort of, I feel like, to get into it, just get into it. But I think there's like lots of ways that people come to curation or this kind of work from other sort of backings, which I think there's even people who sort of went to school, like Alden and Stephanie and Adia, were talking about kind of going to school and then just discovering their path out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, to like build off that last point, Kate, I think I came to it because it was kind of like the only word that I know how to come to like an art space as not necessarily a maker. Like when I was younger, that I always had sort of like a writing practice. I worked in like museums doing sort of like museum education stuff, and there was this idea of like, I want to be in the arts. This gives me an energy and a like connectedness I don't get anywhere else. But I'm not like a capital A artist, so I guess like curation's the way to go. Like this is this thing that I know, this is this like professionalization sort of pathway that I could follow. And so for me, it was kind of like this lack of knowledge of other ways to like sort of get like what the arts can offer. And so I like went to school for art history, and sort of with Adia worked at Sullivan Galleries in 70 as a curatorial assistant. It was great, but it was also quickly taught me that like it got me to a point, but it made me realize that that sort of word or position was also really small, and it was this sort of opportunity to think about, well, what other ways can I engage in the arts that aren't just also this professional idea of curation too. So like finding it as a way to get in, but then also moving beyond or outside of it.
Yeah, I'll build off what you both just shared and say that I also didn't really anticipate myself going into a curatorial career. And my MA thesis advisor, who I'm still close with, likes to remind me that I told her many times I would never be a curator. But that's because I perceive the role as being something as like very static, very object oriented, and some curatorial practices do have that mode. Very static, very pretentious, like stuffy. And I wanted to do something that was probably more like programming oriented. But during my time at SAIC, I started to realize that what I was interested in was relationships between objects and people and space and history. And I couldn't really triangulate that within a paper or within writing as I was trained in my undergraduate. And just by happenstance of I wanted to meet more people, I fell into a curatorial assistantship at Sullivan Galleries, but through that I realized that the exhibition space is how I could explore those relationships and also do it in a dynamic way with people in real time. Hopefully that continues.
It took me a moment to want to claim the term curator as a thing that one does or has a possibility of doing. Like Alden and Stephanie both mentioned, we all came up through the Sullivan Galleries and SAIC, which has, I want to say, very particular methodology when it comes to curating and philosophy about what curator with a capital C is as kind of gatekeeper or authoritarian figure or something like that. And I think what started to make curating click for me as someone who has no background in art history, comes from an anthropology background, in fact, and I didn't think that curating was something that I could do. I think realizing the expansiveness of the term curator, and I mean, it's a term that's around everywhere now for better or for worse, and maybe we get into that discussion later, the pervasiveness of the term, but it takes a moment to realize that curating is this phenomenally expansive thing, and really finding your niche and passion within that and standing true in it and saying that this is what I bring to the table, and recognizing that that's okay is kind of paramount, or at least was in my journey to calling myself a quote unquote curator, if I'm even that still, who knows. But yeah.
I'll just say that, I mean, I similarly, I don't think that this was something that I sort of thought that I'd be doing, but then realized that an amount of the activities that I was doing could be classified as that, and even maybe more specifically as the sort of artist curator thing. But that for me, I think it comes really directly from just having, and being involved in like scenes as a young person, and then also being interested in historical scenes and how they functioned, and being really just like strongly connected to the various ways that all these people that I was excited about had, I mean, in all fields, but in particular in that moment was sort of like musics and poetry and film scenes. That it was like, you know, the person who organizes the show is the same person who the next week is in a different city showing their work, is the janitor, is the writer, is the editor. And so that sort of feeling that in order to like build the culture that you want to see, you have to be performing multiple roles. And then also recognizing that there's like a great deal of interest and excitement in those other spaces, and that like, you know, being the sort of the artist at the center, if that is where we think the artist is wonderful in some ways, but also like that there are you know, really exciting and interesting and important things that can happen in all these different roles, and in particular when they're sort of like blurred together, and the kind of like that flexibility I think generally allows for people to in the playing of different roles to like access different parts of their practice and to build things in a way that feels more exciting than a more kind of like prescribed, segmented and discrete series of practices maybe.
I'll say I also still struggle with calling myself a curator, even if I have done it. But I think I see, because I feel like I see it more as like, I would prefer calling myself like an arts organizer or something like that, because I feel like I care so much for this space that, and like the community and the people involved in this conversation or storytelling. So I feel like I really didn't come into it knowing. I think it was like an opportunity for me to like put me being a little art maker and a little nerd like together and make it accessible to people. And so that was really important to me. But then at the same time, I know that like curator has like this very like intense, like a lot of people perceive it in a really intense way. And so for me, it's all about like undoing that perception if I do call myself a curator for something. But I think it's a lot for me about accessibility, like making stories and like information, research, like how-tos, like accessible.
Yeah, I would say for me, I didn't know what the word curator means, and I think anybody who did came from a privileged background, who came from a family that was in the art industry, who taught or worked at museums. I grew up in a family, immigrant, working class. My mother was an artist per se, wasn't allowed to go to art school because that's not what you do. That's not financially possible, but was still very active in painting and drawing. Took me to art museums. That was my art education. I was taught to value art. It wasn't until years later, coming from a literature background, that I knew I wanted to do something in the arts. Yeah, I'm good at drawing, barely. I can take photos, but for me it was more than that. It was about people. And for me, art is more than just the object itself, but those conversations and people. And that took me a long time to come to. And I've been to various artists, curators talk, and 100% across the board, they're like, I never thought I would do curating. Like, nobody set out to say, I'm going to be a curator. Most people have fallen into it, not totally by accident, but it's been a gradual, latent decision. And I'm not going to dismiss that. I think that's actually really positive, that it's a slow burn. Mm-hmm. But I think what I have found the most interesting curators to be artists who are curators, and to have that double consciousness of, to be a visualist, not just as a maker, but also a visual essayist. And so for me, coming from a art history, literature background, also straight history, it's been a way to make an argument or a case visually, which I haven't been able to do in any other discipline. And that's the ongoing challenge with it. I still haven't figured out how to do curating. I didn't go to a curatorial program, curatorial school, any of that. Same thing, I don't remember who told, I think it was Stephanie. I had a teacher who told me, they're like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I think I want to do curating. Here's my idea. And they're like, you have no idea what a curator is. You're not a curator. It's a challenge, and I think you just have to think about why you want to pursue this. When you get to that point, what do you want to get out of it? But what do you want to contribute to? It is a confluence of many different relationships. And you are always going to be challenged about the way you think about art and the way others do it. And so I think, I'd be curious to hear from your students, based on what we've talked about, our backgrounds with curatorial work, what surprises them the most. Because I think I've had ideas in the past about who curators are, what training they've had. And I'm actually really excited that all of us who are on this call have not had formal training, so to speak, as curators, but we've figured it out.
Yeah, that actually leads into another question that a student posed, which is what kind of education you need to be a curator. And this is something I feel strongly about, actually, because there is there's a rise of
Mhm.
curatorial bachelor's and master's programs that are like even distinct from arts administration programs that are simply curating. And SAIC has kind of flirted with that idea as well. And I think there's something a little troubling about that personally, because I think, much like what Teresa was saying, is like curating is really great when it's something you kind of grow into from, like Adia said, from anthropology, or from, in my case, from being a studio artist. I was just very interested in other people's art. Like, it was as simple as that for me. Like, I just love other people's art, and I wanted to engage with it in a more thorough way. But so, like, some people come into it from art history or from anthropology or from studio art. So, like, I'm a little um, troubled by the rise of the person who like curated from day one or something like that. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
One thing that I was just thinking, I should really need to stop being the first person to talk here, but the one thing I was thinking too is that as everyone was speaking, I was just like, oh God, yeah, what a delightful thing to be on a call with all these people who also feel this thing about that sort of that institutional thing. I think actually, Teresa, one of the first conversations you and I ever had was like sitting on a couch at a party with like, a bunch of other people who maybe I think we both felt were a little on the fancier end of the of the thing that we were doing. And I think one of the things that feels really strong is to sit on a call with you. Remember that? Like one of the things
I do really remember the conversation and the situation.
Yes, it was like I remember being like, all right, that's my new friend. Like just but there was this idea of coming from the outside to something, because you're kind of, I think that's something that everyone's really mentioned, is that coming from the outside to something, and then this idea of being that person who wants to see things happen in that organizer context, that you're sort of like, I want to, and that's a really interesting conversation about what sort of arts organizer and this sort of like where that comes from, sort of like political organizing, that like owning that sort of term or thinking about that term, which like is as being the person who wants to like sort of help manifest the thing in the world, which is also a lot about like what like I think about a lot, which is like visibility and who's kind of doing the like lifting up and doing a lot of that like background work. And I think when you come from the outside of something, sometimes like, I feel like I came from no context for like art or contemporary art or the art world or art market or any of these things. Like coming from the outside of it, it was just really imperative to get into every little nook and cranny that I could find my way into, to like, to like learn about other people's art and to learn about art in general. And I think sometimes coming from the outside is really such a valuable thing, as I think some people have mentioned. It's like, I admire all of the people in this space, and I tend to admire curators who kind of come at things from the arts perspective or come from an outside discipline or background or learning sort of space of learning. It makes for a much more interesting like investigation just about every time, I'd say.
Yeah, I'll also add to that, like thinking about the diversity of practices and people in this call, and what I see overall in Chicago is, I don't know if I have a value judgment yet on curatorial programs, but I am curious and looking to this kind of pipeline that is created, both in terms of like who has access to these kind of curatorial programs, and because I think they're mostly coming out of like expensive liberal arts or private universities, and who can afford them. Also, like, if you can't afford them, or if you do put yourself in debt, I mean, to speak bluntly, there are like 3 curatorial jobs in the United States. Like, where are you coming out on the other side, and who's paying you? And the diversity that we experience with our practices is also like how we, as individuals, fund our projects. So, I mean, I'm just thinking about with the curatorial programs, I'm guessing they cost a lot, and there's pretty much minimal guarantee of like it becoming like of having your investment returned. So yeah.
I just think, Danny, I'll agree with your sentiment of, feeling a lot of types of ways about the increased professionalization of curating and really cementing that capital C onto the term. And I think, you look at the very few, as Stephanie said, job openings that exist in some of these institutions, and they will toss your application without a master's or bachelor's in this particular discipline a lot of the time. So I think about curating within institutional spaces, and these spaces really existing to kind of reify the systems that have come to give them the kind of clout that they have now. So they're raising the next generations of gatekeepers who may or may not come from privileged backgrounds, more often do, but also have the privilege to access and be in spaces that very oftentimes exists because of the exclusion of what they categorize as other. So as we see this increased professionalization, I just see the continual kind of circle or cycle of a system that keeps the same kind of homogenous folks in these gatekeeper positions, in positions of power. Really, they're the tastemakers, they're the knowledge generators a lot of the time of that quote unquote high culture, high art. And it's not necessarily a value judgment, but it is a very problematic and very insidious system that now schools and academic programs seem to be directly feeding into.
Oliver, I can't say much about this sort of the master's program thing. I think it's interesting, but I don't know the sort of answer in there. But I will say that there's, this feels unrelated now. I wanted to say it earlier, but I think it's still in there a little bit. But in terms of like the solidifying that as a discipline, in addition to teaching at whatever levels, I've also been teaching for years through Chicago public schools through CAPE. And one of my favorite projects that happens through there is John Neff, the artist and curator, has been doing this curatorial class with kindergartners up at Ravenswood Elementary. And it is just the coolest thing I've ever encountered. And they have like, I think a couple years ago, Sherwin Oakwood was the artist that they had, and he like brought them a piece and they all worked on it together. And the images of these like kindergartners putting together shows is just like the most incredible thing. And it also feels, I mean, like as soon as I heard that, I was then like the next day in an elementary school, was just like, of course, this is like the perfect place for it. This is the most visually packed place that maybe exists in the entire world, right? Every single person, there's like the 30 variations of a macaroni flag, whatever, like there's so much stuff. And so that, not necessarily in terms of like museological spaces or whatever, but just like more as a way to kind of like get people early on thinking about that like objects are not inert or without meaning or without context, and or that they're or without or that we lack agency as people who are near them, but as people who can sort of like control the way we want to see the world, and also what that does for the lived environment or lived experiences of us and the people around us, I think is like a very delightful thing. So it feels like to me like the same thing with education always, which is like education is the best thing if it's like, if we're talking from a sort of like liberal arts perspective of like access to knowledge, but if it's being used again as a way of sort of like keeping knowledge separate from other people, then of course that's terrible, you know. But like that, I feel like there's something that could be very exciting about like, I mean, I wouldn't mind at this point now, many years in the game, to like take a class on like what it is that I'm doing.
Yeah, totally.
You'd probably be teaching it at this point.
Like just like reinforcing all of my bad habits, all of our bad habits.
Yeah, that's what it is. You break rules. You don't even know what the rules are to begin with. I had no idea.
Yeah.
All I was told was you shouldn't curate.
That's the question is like,
it.
who gets to make those rules? Like, and that's the sort of thing that's like a problem with the program. Is, you know, it's like, I mean, it's important that there are people
like,
who are pushing on that.
Yeah, the person who told me that went to Bard and got, you know, a degree, an MA in curatorial studies, and there's nothing wrong with that. I applied to Bard in I think 2007. I didn't get in, but they wrote me a decent rejection letter saying you had a solid application, very good references, we're very interested in you, but you just don't have any experience. And I was like, yeah, why should I curate out of the box? Like, go to school, They tell you this, this, and this. So I took that to heart, and I was like, I need a radical change. And I went and did something else, you know, and I never applied again, because I was like, why do I have to spend $40,000 to do this program? And there's nothing wrong with that, except I don't have that money, you know, and I knew that I'd be entering a field where I would never make that type of money. You know, back then, I don't know how BART is now, but back then they were very honest about, you're going to be paying, even with like financial aid, $40,000 a semester, and you'll be spending 4 days out of the week in Annandale on Hudson and 3 days in Manhattan. So it's like, I have to get a like apartment down there. And I was like, yeah, if I was, you know, if my parents were wealthy, maybe I could convince them to do that, but no, you know. So it just, you know, it made me rethink, what does it mean to get access to that knowledge? And that knowledge is actually more empirical than what is didactic. So, you know, it took me a long time to get to that moment to figure that out. But I think that's actually the interesting thing about education, even if it's not formal, the longevity of it. You keep learning, you keep figuring it out. Because I can say at this moment, I am a curator, and I'm not going to say it's with a capital C. It's never going to be with a capital C. But I've figured out a lot of things, either on my own or talking to other artists or curators. And that's always going to be my primary source for education.
Yeah, it's all making me think about too, like the assumptions of like where we assume learning is happening too, and this question of like or this assumption that there's a specific type of learning that needs to be acquired to achieve X, Y, or Z, and that type of learning is higher education classroom learning. But I think it's like, how do we sort of expand or understand like moments of more informal, like friendship-based, like collective learning that's happening sort of every day in all of the like weird, funny spaces, moments that we find ourselves in. Like Jesse, I think the story about like being in the kindergarten, right? And like having all of these ideas, that re-seeing the world in this like very off the cuff kind of moment, framed by some of the work you do, but thinking about how, like, I think going to school and getting a master's in art history was fine and well, and it was kind of what I thought I had to do, and I don't regret it. But the biggest thing that school gave me was access to like a community. What school gave me was people, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that there are so many other ways that you can get to that. And I think the thing that really has taught me the most is just about like creating these relationships with such a diverse group of people, especially that are coming out of Chicago, and learning through like using closeness and showing up, Kate, that you've been talking about, and like friendship as a way to like really continually push the way that I'm thinking and learning and expanding like my understanding and practice. And that's, so much of that didn't happen in the classroom. So thinking about, yeah, how do we expand our ways of understanding learning?
Yeah, I want to.
Alden, that's actually a good point, because, sorry, I'm just going to add one point to that for the students, is that access to the community is still not a given. Like when I was in grad school, after seminars, there was me and like 2 or 3 other people that would hang out. And there was so much in that moment to digest what we had just learned, talk about future ideas, and that would solidify, cultivate relationships, some that have to this day carried me and provided opportunities for me. So it's still not just passive, and that you go to an institution and you inherit knowledge from peers. You are pulling them in, you're contributing to that knowledge field and cultivating I hate to use the word networking, because it's been, from a corporate reasons, it's gross, but it is about making connections, fostering them through ongoing dialogue. And even if those lines of communication sort of go dead for a while, you could pick them up later. So I think that's super important. Like you said, that was for me one huge thing with grad school, was meeting people, whether they were like-minded or they challenged the way I thought about art. So with that, Sarita, I'll let you go. Sorry.
That was a great point. So I agree with Alden, of course, because we also are collaborators. So I'm in the same mind frame of that. Expanding how we approach knowledge and accessibility to knowledge is inherently important. At the same time, I also want to, like, even though I'm within that camp, I also want to highlight just a reality of the situation, that you're talking right now to a bunch of curators that work independently. And if you're interested in a curatorial practice that is within a large institution, I've been told multiple times by chief curators and associate curators that you just like need a certain kind of like pedigree, whether it's like an official art historical degree from like Goldsmith in London. Like, even if you operate in a certain kind of independent or expanded view, in order to have some kind of like legibility, I don't agree with this, but I've been told many times that you do need some kind of education in order to even get into the room, which I put back against, but yeah, I think that is a reality of the situation.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, you know, like I think like there's like so I mean, we all know this, right? That like you have to like be or have like a certain amount of privilege to like even go to school. Like I ended up going to like a random little program at UIC for grad school, and I was like the first in my family to go to school, and so like it was like a big deal, and it was kind of weird because I never went to museums or things. I was mainly rooted in like arts education, like learning how to make and then teach. And unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the gigs that I've gotten at museums, it's literally, I'm just able to cross that, like even make it to the application process because I have a master's degree, right? And then sometimes because I speak Spanish, and you know, that wasn't even like, that's something that I carry with me from like growing up, you know? And so at the same time that unfortunately it is this thing that like, if you want to go into institutional stuff, you need like this degree. I also like really encourage and hope that people don't lose like the fact that what everyone's saying is that you need to make connections with people, like the communities that like these exhibitions are going to be in, that these programs are going to be in, you know? And that doesn't happen just like by showing up to class or even going to like a meeting or an event, but it like actually caring and like being there in the community, like advocating for fucked up shit that like people are just trying to survive, you know? And if you have some sort of capital that is like, whether you have like a stable job because you have this like curatorial gig, or whether you have a degree, like figuring out together how you can support each other through just like getting shit done in the community, like whether it is making like an exhibition or it's organizing for like a food pantry or things like that. I think it's like a lot more than doing your homework in the school sense.
It's interesting to hear. Sorry, can I just say one other thing? It's interesting to hear about the ways that we all sort of almost like that school itself was like access and not necessarily like pedigree. It's like part of that thing that you're talking about, Sarita, is like you don't get in the door without that like master's stamp, but it's often like not enough to get you into that, you know, that next thing because it's not quite the right pedigree or whatever it is. I always like think, yeah, I could have totally, you know, I could have maybe you know, had a I feel like I purchased my ability to get into the, you know, I have I'm over $100,000 in student debt for sure. So, and I like to say that out loud because I think it's like another thing that's really important about like what it is that we're sort of like doing, right? Is that essentially like, and I would have maybe paid twice that abstract amount of debt to sit in this room with a bunch of people that I like respect and to have these kind of conversations, but also like showing up and just getting started, like it can be done without that sort of pedigree. And I think the more people that do that and organize in the way that you're talking about, Sarita, and think about the arts as a part of community at large in ways that like you can get involved in lots of kinds of things, is that you don't necessarily need that giant burden of debt. And part of that is like the access that I purchased was what put me into this sort of role, was trying to stay in the game, stay in the conversation. And so like I just, to encourage people to also like just get out there and do it a little bit, like it would be just fine too.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add as the tiniest but maybe kind of obvious thing, that it's also something I talk a lot with students about art making generally, but also curatorial things, as Kay was just saying, is that it's worth being in the game and seeing if this, from a number of reasons, but including just like, is this what a person actually wants to do? Because there's no reason that you have to do any of the different, this is to the students, but also maybe to myself or to all of us, but like, it's partially just about like testing out, like, does this actually interest me? And that's a thing that's better to discover before you go to school for a thing, right? It's like, do the day-to-day mechanics of this, the conversations that are happening, the thing that I'm required to do and the things that I'm excited to do, is that what you want, you know? So I feel like if nothing else, that's like the great advocacy for starting a space in your, whatever, in your front pocket, or however you can do it, just like, so like, does this do it for me? Or does this seem like, this is idiotic? Why am I, that's a totally valid approach also,
Yeah, I think all artists should try curating once. I mean, maybe not stick to it because not everyone's going to have a taste for it, but simply because, I think it's a valuable exercise to like step out of your own shoes as an artist and like think about what other people are thinking about, or and test what kind of community you can make. I think it won't be for everyone, but everyone should give like some time to like cultivating other people's practices, because I think I'm a strong believer that like rising tides raise all ships, you know what I mean? Like
you mean
what?
Global warming, you mean?
Oh yes. So there are a few questions just about making exhibitions, like I mean, one student asked like, how do you come up with an installation? Like, how do you put artworks together? Like, does it consider the architecture? Does it consider things like color, like all the way down to the formal qualities? Like, how do you come up with an installation? Like, what is the strategy behind that?
And everyone is silent. So that's the answer.
Well,
it's
winging it is a big part of it.
It's not straightforward. It's not linear. And I think if you're trying to do that, it's not going to be successful. Like, there's different types of curating. If you're working with a living artist or artists in an exhibition, you as a curator should have an idea about what the framework is going to be. Meaning, like, what's the idea, the big idea, what works from the artist that you want to select. You should be clear about that, because you'll have some artists who try to move more work into the show, and you're like, no, this is my idea. But if they want to add more works, that is a conversation. You have some artists who will be making 7 or 8 different things, and you're like, you know what, just focus on these 4 things, because these are the things that I want in my show. Yes, you definitely have to consider the space and the architectural features and the light and the color and everything. But no matter how much you anticipate ahead of time, and you should have a plan, when you get into the space, know that it will change. And so be flexible, be open, meaning not just in the space, but conversations you're going to have with the artists. I really do have a hard time writing an essay before the opening of the show, because it's continuously changing and my thought process will continue to change. So what I've had to say is to myself, write the essay. It's not going to be the sort of final point about the show, because after it opens and there's an artist talk and like we do a gallery walk, it's going to change too, my thought process. So it's truly dynamic in that way. But there's a ton of variables. You want to have an idea, a framework, but you're going to wing it. Like Danny was saying, you are truly going to wing it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think a lot of people think there's something like you're a fraud if you do that. And you're not. You really aren't. Like, I think if you subscribe to one idea too closely and too religiously, I think you're actually depriving the work and the show of more nuance. And so this is just it. This is messy work either way. It's not going to be like one and done. And you have to understand that. When you show up for install, it's going to take double the time that you think. It's going to make you rethink a lot of stuff that you thought before. You're going to be exhausted by the end of this. And that's actually really productive. I think it is. It really is. And I'm just saying this because nobody told me this. And this has been 100% of my experience with every show that I've curated.
I'll say that I also do a lot of like moving around in the space, and just that one of the things that is like exciting and confusing and confounding and delightful about it is this thing of like, I feel like frequently it's like arranging things and then like pacing around 8 times. Sometimes that's arranging things in time, like in terms of a program, and then returning them maybe to exactly where they were before having had everything moved around 3 times. Like there's something that's very useful about just like seeing the different variations, but then sometimes it is actually that immediate instinctual thought was the right one. But then also just like, in a sort of even more basic version of that is just like thinking about flow, and not necessarily as something that is like linearly presented. Like, you know, a show should not just be an essay on a wall, but something that can be entered from different things, but thinking about flow and then thinking about kind of like different, I don't know, sightlines and different pairings, these different kind of things, and different ways that like the show can sort of like function as different moments. So trying to like put yourself into the position of a viewer walking into a space and like what happens with these things together, how do they sort of work. And I feel like a lot of it's just sort of like reverse engineering the experience as if you were at a thing. Like when you go to shows and you look at 2 things next to each other and a new idea emerges, part of the idea is to produce those confluences for people in a way that also doesn't feel like it's like a math problem that, or like, you know, like easy arithmetic for a person to be like, that's it. But something where it's like there's something mercurial in there, I think can be really, yeah, that to me feels like an important part of it. And like dynamics also.
Mm-hmm. Definitely pacing around randomly and like looking at things from lots of different perspectives and moving things just a little bit to the left and then just a little bit to the right is like, do that as much, do this, you know, stand back, like really think, oh, idea.
Sorry, you can deal with that.
Adia was moving it to the left.
Throw your computer, it gets frustrating.
I want to say this also, one thing that is like really, I think, important, just to jump on the back of Jesse's thing there, which is that always sleeping on things is a really good idea, just as a part of mechanics of these things, is that put something together, you know, I think the principles are a lot the same as any good organizing principles, right? You want to be open, you want to like think on your feet, you want to like set healthy boundaries and expectations, and then, you know, you want to like let things happen, but also like going to bed, leaving enough space for things to like live and coming back to them is like really useful trick mechanics wise. Sorry, Alden.
An apartment gallery, you can literally sleep on.
It's like having a good fight, and the next day you wake up and you're like, oh, here's some clarity to that fight.
Yeah.
This person was right.
Yeah, I was thinking about, as y'all were talking, like 2 words are coming to mind. One is like listening / observing, and one is playing. And so this, thinking about, and Danny, it actually was reminding me of, I think when we were doing this talk at Acre over the summer, you were sort of sharing this anecdote, and I might be totally misremembering it, but it was helpful for me, of like this idea of curation of like, oh, like I have this idea and this is the like theme and this is what I want to curate about, so I'm gonna go find artists that like filter into what that like idea is, versus just sort of like letting yourself acknowledge the things that you're seeing and the work of your friends or peers that you love, and like letting time pass to have things sort of reveal themselves to you over time. and thinking about what does it mean to just sort of like listen and observe and let sort of time and the ideas come to you through the things that you're sort of naturally inherently drawn to. And so this sort of like slower pace of listening and observing, and then sort of once those ideas or those works sort of start to coalesce and you're starting to see these like themes or threads, then playing with it, right? This idea of iteration and like getting them in a room together or getting them in wherever together, and moving them around and putting them in different setups or conversations that make sense, that like totally don't make sense at all, because in those conversations, when those pieces are in proximity to each other that you might not have expected, there are things that arise and unfold because naturally they're going to inform each other in different ways. So this idea of then how do we play with this idea? And I think, Teresa, you were talking about this too, of allowing the idea and the thing to be its own like person, right? It kind of is this thing that exists outside of us, and like think of it as this full person who's trying to like express itself and articulate its needs and its wants, and letting it grow and sort of over time, not boxing it in.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that putting things in physical proximity creates a sort of psychological or conceptual proximity as well. That I mean, in the galleries I've run, I've facilitated a handful of solo shows, but only a couple of them I feel like I actually had a curatorial role in. And so most of my curating is like creating a group out of people and like trying to like create connections in space, like physical connections, putting this work next to this work and then seeing what happens when you look at them next to each other or something. That trying to physical connections creates mental connections.
I just want to add, like, there are so many different types of curating, meaning like you have the juried show, where there are artists that have been vetted by an institution and you are invited to be the guest curator. And there's different ways to think about that versus you have an idea about a show and you are identifying artists, doing studio visits with them. You have invitationals where you invite artists, and even though they're presenting works in their application, they could be different. So it's like there are different ways that you will have to think about putting artists and works together. But I think the common experience will be that there will always be change. It's going to be dynamic, like Danny was saying. Even when you get the works in the space and you see them next to each other, what is this really, provoking? Is this not actually, sort of adding the conversation that you're trying to provoke in the space? So there's so many different types of like curating. There's even curators who are hired by foundations where you're only curating what they have in the collection, so you just have to be creative in that. What is the material that you're working with? What is the strategy? So I also just want to make that clear too, that it's maybe not a complete blank slate in creative expression. There will be parameters from the get-go.
Yeah, it's definitely pivoting within those parameters. And I think something that kind of permeates either the practices or the things that have come up that everyone said is this reliance on and valuing of intuition, that kind of trusting your gut that these things next to one another feel right next to one another, or it's eliciting what you hope a viewer or audience member will want to feel from it. And I don't know, it took me a long time to think that, just saying that these two things look cool together and it feels right is enough of a reason to put them next to one another. That took a really long time to come to that. And relying on intuition in many ways, even if you don't have the words to necessarily articulate why that's a good pairing or not a good pairing, like that's okay as well. And I mean, and I say it took me a long time as in like in maybe January or February at the MCA, the guest curator, Duro Olowu, who has the show up there now. This is going to be the bougiest thing that I say this whole thing, I promise. doing his
We're here
talk.
for it.
Was doing his talk with the executive director of the MCA, and he's a fashion designer, comes from a fashion designing background. Granted, he's married to Thelma Golden, so he knows what curating is. And she's like, what's your process of, putting things together? And he's super suave and super cool. And he's like, I liked them, and totally stumped her. She's wanting thematic underpinnings, what, formally these two things are having a conversation about. And he's like, felt good, and more articulate. But, seeing, he's up there, I'm in the very back row, and, seeing him on stage saying, it felt good, I trusted my intuition, I liked it, next question, that's all you getting, that's my reason. Like, that was a really validating moment of saying, like, yeah, intuition is valid and is a methodology that I think a lot of us rely on, even if we don't frame it with the word intuition or to get woo-woo with it, like the energies that are happening with pieces and works and spaces.
I'll say that, oh, good.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to go off what combining what Adia and Teresa were saying about following your intuition, but something that I think we've been talking about, how do we organize objects within a space, but also the part of exhibition making is having strong communication and having creating and maintaining relationships and trust with the artist. And something that I'm still learning is how to follow my intuition, follow what I think is a good conversation to have between the works. But also, I think artists, especially young living artists, are trying to figure out what their relationship to their works and what a curator even is and what a curator could do. So following my intuition, yes, but also how do I bring in what an artist is thinking a curator does and what I actually want to do? I think it's a lot of negotiating between myself and an artist, especially young artists. And I'm still figuring that out, about how do I maintain a productive and healthy caring relationship with artists while also following my intuition, but also making sure that they feel comfortable and that their ideas are being realized. So it's, negotiating objects, but also negotiating between people as part of the exhibition process. Oh, sorry.
And I think the third space in this, the third person, is the audience, which we haven't talked about. And that's the hardest thing to really articulate. We can have intuition about arrangement and space and conversations between the curator and the artist. And I think those are very important to get in alignment when presenting to an audience. But I think sometimes I get presented this question, like, who is this exhibition for? What do you want the audience to get out of this? And yes, audience is very much on my mind. Like, I want to be generous with how I put something in space. I don't want to be patronizing. But it's so hard too with audience, because our audience is such a wide span. And I really love that, is that you can get those who are fluent, that have an art background, went to the academy, and others that haven't, but have been lifelong enthusiasts of art. And so I think some of that is like, you can try to communicate something to the audience, but then when it gets to that moment, you have to listen to the audience and what they're saying and what they're receiving, which I think is super important. And like, there is that third person, there's a third space there too.
Yeah, I think. Oh,
no, go ahead.
Oh. Yeah, I think kind of going along with that, for me, when I've kind of undergone curatorial projects, it's really important for me to talk to hella people, like just a bunch of people, like even if they're like slightly like interested in whatever topic is happening, like just talking, like getting coffee, or like going and just meeting up and going to their events or things like that, and immediately making those connections with potential audiences, to the show, so that in a lot of ways you could potentially get feedback on ideas, or like kind of co-create a little bit, and maybe like a super non-formal way, but like I think that's been super important to me, has been just like really talking to like, and you know, not just like the artists, right, or like even whatever institution or space it's gonna be at, but like whoever's next door to the space, you know, or potential like different stakeholders is like a word that I use, you know, but
totally
yeah.
One thing that I was just wanted to add, one last thing to this question was, so I got to be, I was one of the first curatorial fellows at Acre and was a part of developing and figuring out what a curatorial fellowship like looked like. And I think initially there was this idea, Acre sort of started, and it always had an exhibition component. And it was like that, as artists, we were just like given a space to put a show. So it was like, you know, every artist who was a resident then just had this access to this apartment gallery and could just like put their own show on. And there was maybe, I think I remember being sort of concerned about developing some kind of program or context for saying that like an artist shouldn't be the one responsible for putting on their show, but that we should give a curator the opportunity to organize these shows. And the debate was really an interesting one. And I think I was just thinking about the ways that I think my opinion of, and like the way that I've thought about that program, or the idea of having curatorial work as a part of this thing, at least a part of the organization, that my way of thinking about it has changed a lot. But principally it was that, you know, you get a group of interesting people who have interesting practices into another space with another group of interesting people who have interesting practices, and you will end up with something like interesting, like to like sort of produced by that. And that is like, and whether that's random or it has, you know, it has different sort of purpose and it has different sort of randomness, that always seems to be true. And I was just thinking, as a student, you know, there's this thing of how to do this, right? This question is like part about mechanics, it's part about process, it's part about approach. And I think the thing is that like, you know, you can kind of start there, look at the things and the people that are like interesting, be in, you know, like develop yourself as someone who has interests and is curious and is learning, and just start, as Sarita, you're also saying, and I think everyone's saying, just start having those conversations and seeing what kind of happens. It sort of never fails, right? You kind of, wow, I really like what you're doing. Like, let's try doing something else together. It's kind of like it's a formula that will nearly every time produce something, and then, you know, do all the other things that are mechanical and process wise.
Yeah, and I think that it's making me think of like this ethos or like mythology of like curator as like sort of independent person who has this like role and is gonna like come in and sort of make these decisions. And maybe they exist like that, curators exist and work that way, but like thinking about what we're all sort of getting at is like, you know, what is the role of like collaboration in curation, which I don't think is oftentimes like filtered into at least what my understanding of a curator was for like a long time. And thinking about like what everyone's echoing, kind of what these last sentiments are of, how do we like potentially share that role, right? And like think about everyone who's working on this project, from artist to curator to art handler to whoever, as like part of the process of like putting on and influencing and adding commentary about how the exhibition then formulates as this sort of whole and open to the public.
Yeah, it's truly like the most collaborative kind of work I've ever like gotten to do. It's like very fun in that way.
I want to offer also.
That's an important thing to recognize. Totally. Sorry, I'm just going to add one thing, Jesse. That is a totally important thing to recognize, and to dismiss the idea of authorship being one person. Is it the curator, the artist, the art handlers, if you're in an institution, the security guards. Like my show currently at the Cultural Center is actually really having a lot of conversations with the security guards before the show open. They are in a way stewards of the show, not just in protecting it, but in speaking to the public when they have questions. And so getting over that idea that there is one author, one voice, will just help the show have more nuance and resonate with a wider audience, which is so huge. So yeah, Kate, like I think this is something that we know, but it wasn't, you're not actually taught that in an institution. It's still very much this idea of like something originated from one person and they delegated this to everybody else. And that's totally not true. It is an exchange. Jesse.
I just want to say, I mean, kind of related to, I mean, now like 5 comments ago, but the kind of idea around intuition in particular, and now talking to what is the perceived audience for what we're doing right now, is how much intuition as a sort of thing that feels difficult to pin down is in some ways just sort of like the difficult to articulate series of thoughts that you're having and observations that you've had. And so intuition also shifts dramatically based on what you're sort of paying attention to. And so as much as I can sort of like say that certain elements of what I'm doing are unnameable, it also is in large part based on having been at so many things over a long time. And that's also one of the ways that, maybe not in terms of like the full presentation and professional component of an exhibition, like that doesn't teach you how to like hang a thing physically on the wall, but it does teach you all the other things, like how the paratext functions inside of a show is something that you can read about, but you can also just show up and pay attention to the different languages that are used in different kinds of spaces, and the way that lighting functions, all these different things are things that are really just like honed from being at lots of different events and different shows, and sort of like trying to, whether you do it intentionally or just sort of like use your observational powers or writing things down of like, what are the, how long are things? How long did somebody talk for? What is the shape of this thing? What are like all the sort of like individual components, and those things are honed. And sometimes into just like realizing the sameness of a lot of shows, which is also fine. Like that's then a way of like understanding when you get in the room, if I want this to look sort of like the most like everything else that has ever looked, which is to say, fine, because that's like how, you know, most books work or something like that. Then you kind of have that like those that apparatus prepared, or then also knowing like how and when you want to subvert the sort of like dominant norms. But that is the thing that's kind of like, I think, based on.
What do you mean by sameness? Sorry, Jesse. What do you mean by sameness? Is there like certain conventions of curating?
Yeah, like that. I mean, so to speak to screenings, let's say, for instance, like, I mean, we could talk about exhibitions also, but it's a thing where it's like, in general, they are of a similar length. The kind of like the way things are written about is similar. Even like the formatting of program notes is similar. There's like, and some of these things are the ritualized components that make a thing what is exciting for us, like going to a show and getting stamped on the hand, and you walk over here and this thing happens, and there's this amount of time between acts, and the colors are red and blue lights, and those go back and forth, and we're prepared for, you know, the song is over because the person has said thank you, even though in other parts of our lives, if you say thank you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're done, whatever, like all those kinds of things. Or just like, you know, like 60 on center, the way that lighting is supposed to function in terms of like where shadows are, how didactics are written and where they're placed, what is like the flow of information on them, all that kind of stuff. And not that there's like any, you know, like on a walk sheet, like the bios are never at the front, right? They're always at the end. You kind of have it this order, whatever those things are. And a lot of those have developed as best practices because they just sort of like make sense for walking into a room. But I think there's also a way that is a thing that like through spending a lot of time with those things, and it's like, okay, so in this case, here's the move, this thing over here. That's what I mean in terms of the intuition, is like figuring out, or like the cultivated intuition that can lead to either sameness or to more openness.
There's also like they made me think about also just like not getting overly bent out of shape about those things not being there. You know, like it's fun to play in that space, but also like maybe the space that you're working in doesn't have great lighting, or you know, Jesse's like, you know, or Western Pole is like, it is a non-traditional, like, you know, a sort of non-traditional space, and like it's going to have, things are going to influence the work in that space, right? The weather, right? The other people in the world, like there's lots of things, but I think, you know, wherever it is that you're sort of beginning with a thing, what you have available to you as like tools are also like perfectly good sometimes, and like everything doesn't have to look, it's a fun place to play, but also everything doesn't have to look perfect or right or the same or whatever. Like sometimes you can pin a thing to a wall and that's cool too. Like you can make things look, you know, like you can start wherever you're starting, just like start there.
Jesse mentioned ritual, which was actually kind of a good segue because one of my questions from one of the students is there a ritualistic part of your practice when choosing ideas for exhibitions? And I always struggle with what the meaning of the word ritual is. So I think I know how to answer this question, but I'm not sure because rituals on the one hand are things like brushing your teeth, like things you just do every day, but there's also the kind of like mystical side of ritual that's like very otherworldly. And I know for me it's like uh, doing studio visits is something that I really like love doing, and so like this practice of like if I know I'm putting together a show with an artist, doing a studio visit with and like really listening to them, and then going home and like writing down a lot of the ideas that they provided, so that like my practice of writing is like exhibitions have become the location for my practice of writing. And so like allowing other people's ideas in, like this ritual of writing is like a way of me connecting with that person, and like sharing our contributions to the idea of a show. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that was like kind of my idea. But if y'all want to take it away on that one.
Yeah, I feel like I kind of connect with that too. I think like whenever I like have a coffee date with someone or a studio visit or whatever, I like, and we have like this predetermined thing that we're going to talk about, I'll like have my little list of questions that I prepare before, but like when we end up meeting, I throw out the window and I just kind of like treat it like an oral history, you know, and just kind of like listen and like have an exchange, and then like the conversation informs itself and then the project does too. And then later on I'll probably like write to them, whoever I met with, like or send them a note, sharing with them like my sort of reflections on our impromptu oral history conversation or whatever. But I honestly think it really does help me, because it doesn't make me like stay so focused on like these predetermined ideas that I had, because like of course whenever you're gonna have a connection with someone, like shit changes, you know, like it's just, we're fluid, constantly changing, and so I feel like that's helped me in a lot of things, like just any like any sort of project based thing.
Yeah, I can answer ritual from like a process oriented space of, I don't know if I have like a ritual in terms of how I interact with the artist. I feel like it's always like very individual, but in terms of how I organize my notes, well, actually this comes from the Kate Zeller method of how I first came into curating, which was the SCIC MFA show and the slideshow that we all put together of like 100+ artists. And I think that's probably where I got it from. But for each show, I create a PowerPoint slideshow where it's just like a place where I always add my notes and where I add my photos, whether it's from the website or from like studio visits. And so each artist gets a slide, and each slide, you know, has like the editor's notes. So I just add all of my notes so it's all in one place instead of like interleaved in my notebook and I can't find them. It's just every artist has a slide. It has all of their photos, has all of my notes in the presenter notes. And then I can also move things around so I can kind of see in real time how, or like see all in one place, how different artworks kind of look together. I mean, it's not in a physical space, it's on like one flat computer, but it's a way that I can maybe start seeing some like color stories, or how I can start seeing like iterative forms happening in one place. So each show that I've done has manifested differently in conversation, but I always go to my slideshow for each exhibition.
That's so organized.
I was going to say, now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm like very self-conscious. Yeah, I was like, now that I said it out loud, everyone kind of stared at me. I'm like, that just is revealing my very anal.
Like, I'm like in awe. It's beautiful. I was like, no wonder Stephanie's shows always look so great. Like,
yeah, they're very like
tight. No, in a good way, not in a tight way, but
yeah. The slideshows.
I feel like my process is similarly. I think it's a lot of long. I like epically long studio visits, and I want to speak right after you, Stephanie, because I'm thinking about how I like to like go back and I'm like, what pad of note paper did I put all of those notes on, and then looking at that and being like, you got nothing. You got nothing. What did you like? You know, like what were you doing while you were having that studio visit? And you know, like having that little panic moment, and then there's you know, it's a little bit of a messy process for me, but I think really long conversations where I almost feel like I used to not know how to do this, and now I feel like I kind of know what the prompt is, but I feel like when I first started, I would ask people to just tell me about your practice like I'm not from this thing. Like, what is it that you think about? What is it that you like doing? Like, what are you reading right now? What are the influences of this? I want to have that. I think, Sarita, I'm really appreciative of, I kind of come from a place of oral history too. I love that you're like bringing that into the like framework in there, because I think it feels a lot like that. It's like, for me, it's also, you know, every sort of moment that you're putting forward from somebody's practice does feel like it contains maybe everything that's come before that and everything that might come after. So an oral history is something that can be very, like useful, and I think I tend to think about things or come at them from that like really big long lens, and then try to get smaller and smaller as I go. And some part of that for me also is about researching things and reading about things. Like usually when I sit down to write, I always tend to start somewhere out of left field. You know, what's the thing that I'm like thinking about right now, or like reading, or something that I find fascinating, and trying to sort of like pull that into like these kinds of conversations. A good example of that is like a number of years ago, I was spinning there's a series of little shows and screenings and things that were all kind of around like the overview effect and like gravity. I was like thinking a lot about those two things, perspective shifts and just like the sort of pull of gravity, and like coming at the artists' practices that I was all working with felt like they all sort of related to some of those things. And so I would sort of approach some parts of the writing by starting to write about something that was completely unrelated. And then it would hone down, and I would start to be able to make connections and pull together frameworks and thematics and content and conceptualization, like from there. Is one, you know, it's like a little bit of a mess. It's a much messier way of like maybe approaching, but I think that kind of thinking about these like big long conversations, thinking about the ways in which work connects is one way to do it. I don't know. I didn't have an ending there. I'm just gonna trail off into nothing. But yeah,
I think I've learned. It's also thinking about. I think this is like a also fascinating question. It's making me think about like, what are the ways, how do we learn of the ways, a more tuned way of our own processing systems, and like background processing systems. And something that I've learned that's been like incredibly helpful in terms of how I can like visualize and expand ideas is that, because it gets so messy in my head and there's just so much information. And so externalizing it through like writing down, like I'm a huge fan of Post-it notes, and like having these physical, there's like, they're all over my apartment. My cat like eats them all now. Having this sort of like physical space to, as like a container for a thought, and being able to place it in a sort of physical landscape, and then be able to sort of similarly what we were talking about in terms of like arranging objects and playing with like proximity and closeness, doing something similar with the ideas that are starting to ferment, and giving them sort of space that I can like lay out around me and play around and sort of play like architect of these ideas. And it allows them to just feel a little bit more organized, or I see patterns that I wouldn't have seen otherwise when it all just gets like stacked and sort of muddled in my head. Or for me on a computer, it becomes very linear, and I have a hard time also seeing like relationships between things. So yeah, translating thoughts to be physical to then interact in new and different ways.
I think Alden, I wish I could show you my sorry, I wish I could show you my coffee table right now. It's covered in Post-it notes.
Such a fan.
Love it.
Sorry, Adia.
No, you're fine. I think when I think about process and ritual, something that I've integrated into my own practice, and part of that goes to something that Sarita says is going back to the artist after this process of listening and digesting what they've said, especially when working with artists who come from backgrounds that don't often get to author their own stories. So asking what, I don't know, they feel fits into the framework of the exhibition that's being created, because of not only do they know their work the best as the one who's created it, but how then they contextualize themselves within this kind of larger thematic thing that's being built that then becomes an exhibition, program, what have you. So that's been a really, I think, ritualized step, because I think there's some healing integrated into that of, you know, allowing authorship of one's own story. And then at the ending stage of exhibition making, I also handwrite notes to artists that I've worked with and mail them whenever I can. So that I like writing letters. So that's fun for me, but it's become a very kind of self-reflexive practice as well, of thinking through the process of developing a relationship with the artist, the exhibition, the entirety of this journey that we've been on, smoothly, tumultuously, what have you, together, and kind of punctuating it at the end with that letter.
That's so nice.
To add to that, of like the self-reflection part of, I think most of us have this ritual of after an exhibition opening, like going to Skylark or a bar somewhere to have a beer. They're the artist.
That's the ritual.
That is a ritual. It's just like a way like to have these kind of like
best ritual,
off the cuff, improvisational, like informal conversations about the work. And I think most, if not all of us, have that ritual after an exhibition opening.
Can I say that might have been somewhere along the line the initial like sort of draw to curation is no, for real. It's a little bit that thing of being like, how do you be a part of this conversation, and the hanging out is a big part of that. Like community making is also like hanging out a lot. And then how
did you have it in the bag?
That's amazing. And I think one of the things that's been really sad a little bit is that as I've gotten sort of further along, or the time between active sort of things like it gets shorter and shorter, that celebration fades, and you don't go out after every single event because you have one in 2 hours, or you have one the next night or something like that. And I think it's a really, really important piece that really drove me into this, was like to get to be, you know, in that space with each other, to like have these like casual conversations. One of the best things is, you know, I do this program at the MOCP video playlist, and often I have people who are really established and they don't want to go to drinks with me afterward because they want to go home, and this is a tiny little program that they're doing, and it's not that big of a deal. And then it's so fun to work with the curators in that space and the artists who are like, we all came to this and let's all go out, and then we can spend a night getting to know each other in this other way. And that is I don't know, that just like makes for all of these other great ideas and great things to sort of happen, like for things to happen next. So yeah, that I forgot about that ritual. That's the best ritual.
It's like the making of the thing takes up 98% of the time, but the two is like celebrating like what you created as a group, each other,
high-fiving each other.
so nice. Great ritual.
Yeah, do that ritual as much as you can. Never let it go.
Yeah, and then also how it like chain reacts into like maybe like the next project or the next part.
Yeah.
Because exhibitions have like the formal programming of like the artist talk, the curators tour, et cetera, but there's conversations at 12 a.m. while you're like drunk on like $3 beers that makes new projects after that in the morning. Me and Alden are one of those. And I was out of one of those conversations. So yeah, that is a very integral ritual in my practice.
Well, it's interesting the way that Adia, you were talking about healing. it's interesting the way that feels like that particular ritual feels like it has a piece of that attached to it, because it's not just about doing the thing and letting it go. It's about really like living in the space of that moment and like celebrating, you know, the little bit of vulnerability that is an exhibition or that is publicly producing something like this, and then to like stay in that space and be relieved by it and like take deep breaths together and kind of like live in it I like love that you bring that up in your practice a lot. I think that's really it's that I never that's really cool.
I want to keep it to two more questions, and one of them, and I might actually toss this question first to Teresa, because it's very similar to a question that appeared when I applied to the curatorial fellowship at CAC, that appeared on that application, is like, what are some potential conflicts between artist and curator? We like to think of it as like this like kind of idyllic, wonderful collaboration, but
Never.
Artist and curator can be, in the worst case scenario, like an adversarial. So, well, that's an exaggeration. Adversarial might be extreme, but
no, it's not.
what are like potential conflicts, and how do you mediate them?
Yes. So, in my position with the Hatch residency, it's a dual program, meaning we have a artist residency, a curatorial one, and they work in tandem for like a year and a half to do exhibitions. I have definitely had experiences with curators and artists who do not get along, which has made it not productive, generative for the others who are in the shows. And it's just, I don't know how to describe it. It's, you know, I always encourage, because this is something that everyone will have to deal with. So I encourage them to talk it out, you know, try to come to an agreement about something. If there's an impasse and they let me know, I will hear them out. Really, I'm just in a position just to hear them out. Oftentimes what I know is that one side takes issue with something but hasn't communicated it to the other side. So they're just telling me like this and this issue, and I'm like, okay, I'm like, have you told the curator or have you told the artist? And they're like, well, no. I said, okay, what you're saying is valid, so to speak, but you need to talk to them first and figure this out. And if you don't, then come to me. Otherwise, as an administrator, it seems like I might be taking sides, or, you know, I'm playing referee or whatever. And I'm not there to do that. I'm there just to hear it out. But for me, I don't want to get into that position, because this is what artists and curators have to figure out together, is how to work together. Even if it becomes tumultuous, you know, there is a way to work through issues, which is usually, I think the hardest thing that comes across is a clash of communication. Like, communication styles are different, and there may have been things communicated early on, ideas about the show that change, and one side is very rigid about that, and the other is more still free flowing and figuring it out. It's going to happen. I think it will definitely happen. As a curator, I think you just need to listen. I think first is listen. It is a privilege to be a curator. To work with artists is a privilege. And you have ideas, you've done your research, you've done a lot of deep thinking about a show. If you're working with an artist and you get to that moment where you're getting close to the exhibition opening and there's problems, you need to listen. And I don't encourage overriding what artists say. I think it's a good skill to learn to listen and to challenge your thinking about a show. What you have to know as a curator, if it's a group exhibition and there's one artist trying to override everybody else, it's a shared exhibition. It's not a solo show. So that's also something you have to be aware of too, is not allowing one artist to take up a lot of real estate in the space. You know, in terms of conflict, it's funny because I have seen this 3 or 4 times just in the Hatch residency program. Artists and curators who in the beginning of the process were fine, got into a lot of problems, maybe didn't totally resolve them, but executed the show. After the program, they've gone on to work together, which I think is pretty amazing. Because I really thought like at the end of the program, they would just part ways and be like, okay, that was that. But they've, in a way, challenged each other. And I thought it was maybe not productive, but they felt it was productive enough that after the program, they worked together. So even when something is tumultuous, it doesn't mean that it's not generative. I can't tell you what that looks like. You know, you as a curator and artist understand what is fruitful and what is not generative. I think, I don't know, Danny, like to say like, how do you navigate issues? And I know we asked this in the application, and it's more to vet, has somebody had an issue in the past and how do they go about it? Because if you're coming into the program thinking everything is going to be a piece of cake, so to speak, that relationships are going to be solid from the beginning, everybody's going to be on the same footing, it's not true. It's absolutely not true. And, you know, I've come to problems with, even in my own curatorial practice, I've had, you know, issues with artists about the way I frame their work, the way I write about their work, and we've had these conversations, and sometimes it's like, you know what, we had an email exchange, I'll talk to you next week. And then we talk about it, and then, you know, we figure it out. I work with curators, and, you know, in the beginning it was fine, and then just really just became, you know, came undone. And so you try to figure out how to weave it back together. So I think, I hate to use this cliche, but the show goes on. And so you have to figure out how to manage these relationships to get the objective done, which is the exhibition and the writing, and you're doing the programming. And, you know, it'll be messy, it won't be easy, but it's definitely something I've learned a lot from those challenges. And so I think more than anything is to prepare that these issues will come up. You know, I think as a curator, again, I think you have to be strong listening. You know, do not interrupt when somebody's talking to you. I've had this before too. I've talked to curators and I'm like, all right, you're having an issue with artists, just listen to them. And really, like, artist says like 2 sentences and the curator interrupts them. They're like, no, I meant that, you know, like getting really defensive. And I think to be an active listener really means to allow that person to fully express what they're thinking. You absorb that, process it, and then state what your feelings are. Any type of interruption really shuts down the conversation, even when you think you're right. I don't know. I'm also a middle child, so I had to be a mediator all my life. No, seriously, this is what my entire life is.
That's classic middle child, yeah.
It is. Like my older siblings and my younger siblings fight all the time. And I get all the text messages that they complain about one another. And I'm just like, all right, I hear you. You know, once in a while I'll make a suggestion. I'm like, maybe you should tell him this, or, you know, tell her that. And it's not to trivialize it, but I think in a way learning to mediate is really important in these relationships. So I think that's probably there's no way to go about it, but I think being more of a mediator than being an adversary is the most important thing.
It's also probably a very obvious thing, but sometimes it's worth saying obvious things, which is that also everything Teresa said is not just about artist-curator relationships, but relationships with other people generally. take heed if anybody needs to return to this when you're feeling stymied by a roommate, a partner, a parent, oneself.
Mm-hmm.
There's that thing about, like all of this work is the work of like good, any kind of community building, right? It's like, listen, be open to collaboration, set healthy boundaries and expectations. Like I know I said that earlier, but these are things, come at things with like, generosity first, like, and then like being open to like, I think Adia made a really good point about who gets to be the author of somebody's story and what kind of position that puts you in, and it's a position of needing to be open to what it is that really means.
On a practical standpoint, I'm a firm believer in the point-by-point compromise in in a lot of conflicts. Like the worst conflict I ever got in like this, I was actually on the artist side, where like I had a solo show and the curators really wanted me, like it was an overreach into the who is the author here, and there was like, and it came down to me being like, I will do this for you, and then I will do this other thing for me. And then like we just went through like point by point. I really believe in the point by point compromise. And then in the end we were both like incredibly happy. Like everything was great. So
kind of related to that, maybe just like another way that I have done things before when there is like conflict is sometimes also that if there are like several different axes of challenge or moments for collaboration or compromise or something like that, is also sometimes, I mean, unless one person is domineering, in which case maybe like a point by point thing, is also just like at any moment, if one person feels really strongly about a thing and the other person doesn't particularly care, then the person who like cares more should be the one who wins that little kind of because I just know that, I mean, sometimes I feel like there can be a situation in which there's like 45 axes of compromise and whatever conflict. But then in some cases, it's sort of like, it turns out I actually don't care about that. I don't know why I'm making such a big thing about it. Like that. And if this is like the thing that you most care about, then of course you get that,
Yeah. Pick your battles.
Choose your battles, man. Like,
yeah. And also maybe, and this might be a practical note that again, people already know, like place your battles in an appropriate field, as in like, by text or by email, because those will
say that, Stephanie.
That's a really well. Can we get that stitched on a pillow? like,
oh yeah, right here. From personal experience, if you can always have a conversation person to person, whether that's not necessarily face to face, but over the phone, it will. Yeah. So much.
Turn down the heat. Like any opportunity that you have to turn down the heat, turn it down. It's like like.
And if it has to be over email, don't bold anything or underline anything.
Or like 20 exclamation points. Don't do that.
Yeah. Making a phone call is
person conversation. Yeah, phone call is much better.
Yeah.
There's also always this too, which is you know, sometimes you can just say like, okay, or like you can just say, I'm sorry that you feel that way, or you can say like, I hear you, like someone comes with some big thing, and sometimes people have a lot going on that's making someone like upset or putting you in conflict, and you can always say like, that's a lot, yeah, absolutely, let's talk. Or everything doesn't require your first response. Like make your second, your third response like the response, because that often will be the one that is that promotes healing and and sort of furthering the relationship than to sort of come back with all of the reasons.
Yeah, it's something that I'm trying to practice because I can definitely come in hot pretty fast. So I've been trying to learn how to know when to hold and institute a kind of thinking of like, okay, I hear this. We're meeting next week for a studio visit. Let's talk about it then. Than me being like, I need to have the answer or the final decision right now. And then I'm practicing. I don't really have a great handle on it yet.
And I think remembering too that sometimes people, I'm thinking specifically over email or text, but even in person, there are responses that happen that feel totally disproportionate to what is going on in the way you're perceiving it. and just remembering about that, like, proportion, for lack of a better word, of like, people have all of these other things and situations going on, so that the proportion of their response or the way that they're reacting or how hot they're coming in or how long the email is might also not have anything to do with the situation. And again, I think really reiterating, how to sort of hold and acknowledge what someone is saying, but then really bring it back to in person or through the phone as a way. I think it's just a good mediator to bring everyone to sort of a similar level or playing field in terms of sort of emotionally or intellectually sort of grappling with some of this stuff.
Yeah. I think just basic advice, de-escalate, like what Kate was saying. And just, I think just and don't be petty. Really don't be petty. I feel like I'm a very tolerant person. I don't tolerate pettiness when it's not followed up by an apology. When you come, like I'm just going to be that way. I'm going to be honest. Like, I've had people that I've come into, negative situations with. We've tried to work it out. Maybe we do. I will apologize. The person refuses to. That's fine. I just wash my hands and walk away. And I'm like, not going to work with you again. So, and I don't think that's being petty. I think it's just recognizing that isn't a relationship I want to pursue, and that's not, I don't want to support that person. And there's nothing wrong with that too. What your limits are.
The boundaries,
yeah.
And maybe just slightly related to that also is that there are, just whether it's our placement within the family, if you're a middle child who's also an ENTP, who's a Libra that happens to have these dietary restrictions, whatever the sort of like particular person are, is that like there are people that you will communicate with really easily and joyously in a way that is like super productive, and people that, despite your both your best intentions, like it's just very difficult to communicate. And in general, it sometimes makes things easier to find yourself in situations with people that like make you feel excited and joyous, instead of people where it's sort of like, that's not what I meant, and you're both just saying that's not what I meant to each other, like two robots in the chat room.
I don't want to hold everyone too much longer, so I want to move to the last question, and we'll try, I guess, not to make it the biggest the biggest question, but what is curating like now during this time, in the time of COVID-19? Just like, have you gotten any insights? Are you still like totally like, I have no idea? I mean, that would be my answer, quite honestly. It's like I still just don't know. And I hope that we don't lose like live things, synchronous things. I hope that's not something that goes by the wayside. I love looking at art on Instagram, but I don't want that to be my, like, I don't want every interaction to be like you see it when you see it, but having things happen in real time is something I don't want to lose sight of. And that's all I kind of have to say about it. But
yeah, I mean, I can answer in one way, in that technically right now I should have an exhibition open at CIC. I should be about to install a show at Acre, and those are not happening. So, or they're not happening now. Hopefully they'll be happening in the future. But for me, my first instinct is that I can appreciate people who are moving their practices into a virtual realm, but I know that that is not what is immediately interesting for me, and moreover, it's not what my artists are interested in doing. So for me, it's not necessarily focusing on dissemination, but focusing on the artists themselves and what are they saying they need, and those platforms and structures for them. So for example, the artists for my CAC show, they are just like grappling with the situation, but they did say that they enjoy regular group meetings just to either talk about like what they've baked that day, or to talk about how they've been able to transform their studios into their homes. But for the Acre artists that I'm working with, what they found most practical is that in addition to like maybe an exhibition, they just want to create something and they want to create something together. So for me, it's about how can we create something across time zones, because they're everywhere, and then how can we have that collect into one space. So curating for me is about how can I listen to the artists and what they need in this moment and try to create the structure for them to do so. Maybe later it'll be an exhibition.
It's a big challenge, and you know, I want to say like 10 years ago when I was grad school, everybody's like, oh yeah, all exhibitions are going to be online, you know, it's going to be virtual. Why do you need you know, and it didn't go anywhere, except for new media. But even then, and now it's hard for me as an art administrator to think about what does it mean to have a show in a space that's not viewable to the public. Yes, like definitely we can have gallery shots and share those with the public. There's definitely programming that was put on hold with the Hat Show. They've been successful in moving that online, which has been really great. Like they had an artist talk online on Wednesday, and we had like over 50 people on the call, which was great, the Zoom call. So it's hard to say when from the outset the show was supposed to be in a live space. How do you like, for instance, right now with my show at the Cultural Center, it was open for about 6 weeks. We had all this programming lined up. We only did one program. Luis and I are trying to figure out what to do. We're putting together a PowerPoint, not just with images of the show, but also giving it a bit more context, which is maybe some, you know, you don't normally do with didactics that say next to the piece, here are some sources or ideas that we've thought about, but we can now put this together in a PowerPoint to share with others, and to look at some of these resources. A lot of them are actually at the Newberry Library. So when we reopen, what I'm kind of concerned about is when we do reopen, what does it mean to have a mass gathering? And that is going to be different. That's not going to be the same even when we reopen the space. And it's how to calculate, which I've never done before. It's like, how do you calculate a mass gathering? How do you prepare people to be vigilant when they enter the space, or to know to select out of it because they don't feel well? You know, right now I'm coming up with different scenarios. I'm hoping we will open on June 15th, reopen. I want to extend the show that's up for another 2 weeks and then start the cycle over. Does it mean going forward that we have one opening and we have anywhere between 200 to 300 people that show up in a 3-hour span? Do we have multiple openings? Do we have openings that allows for so many people at a time? Like, this is the really tricky part right now, is like, I still value the in real life, in the space experience. I mean, that's how I learned and experienced art. And to me, that's super valuable. Looking at things on Instagram, on, you know, on websites, of course, has been really valuable, but I'm still like that person. It's like, I need to be there. So that's one issue, but there's also presented different opportunities. So one thing is, I'm a member of Tiger Strikes Asteroid, and we are doing right now something called PDF exhibitions, which is, now that we're in this moment of quarantine, different members are putting together images as a curated exhibition in a PDF to disseminate. So it's very much thinking about a cohesive show, but you know that the mode of display is a PDF. So what does it mean to curate a show that's in a PDF? So, you know, that's sort of another new challenge that I've been looking at, which I think is actually really fun. And then in another way, I mean, this is just an idea I came up with this morning, was like, I wanted to do a zine about lonely exhibitions, about all the shows that are up right now that have no visitors, you know, they're sort of like cobwebs right now, and like having images put together of those, or, you know, maybe we don't have images and we're drawing from memory of these shows that are up right now, but nobody can get access to firsthand, and sort of like functions as an archive of what happened in this moment. But I think it also will provoke the question of, truly, what does it mean to have an art exhibition when you don't have a physical audience? You know, you can have a virtual audience, but not having a physical audience, which does upend, as a curator, when you put a lot of thought into how work is going to be displayed in the space, and then therefore can't be experienced firsthand. So I haven't figured it out. I mean, it's just curating in COVID means I really hope that we will get back to the point where we can do live exhibitions, we can do mass gatherings, but I'm also not naive to know that, or to think that it'll be exactly the same. And so we really have to sort of think about that in coordinating different events, you know. So I don't know, it's not easy.
Yeah, I really think also, just as another art like person in sort of a arts administrator kind of role too, is like this moment really does feel like the time to really lean into, like, think what all of us are saying about what being a curator means for each person in this group, which is this, like, these other exercises in community building and like sharing and in that kind of these like sort of value exchange and these exchanges, the conversations and the organizing that sort of happened, like the sort of work that's being done on the ground around the thing, is we can't gather in public, which is that other piece of that community building, that part of that ritual, as we're talking about, like going out to Skylark afterwards and these kinds of things. Those pieces are being so important, but also this is that moment to kind of lean on or lean into this other work that gets done. Like the conversation that we're having at Acre, and we're going to continue to have at Acre, about what we're going to do with each of our shows, really has to be about what it is that like both parties that are practicing in that space need, the curator and the artists, and how we're going to, as Stephanie was nicely putting, like what it is that people need from their practice, like what it is that people need from these kinds of public opportunities for their practices in this moment. And that might mean a lot of different things. And that also might mean holding off and doing it later when it is like when something is better, or when you can figure it out better. There's I think there's a real need to be flexible, and not just to produce content, but to like think about how that content is you know, meaningful, and like it can be an experience that's like that's useful, because yeah, it's like when the work is gathering together and getting people to be together, I think that's it's like a big challenge. And so then it's just sort of like extending that.
Yeah, I'll also add, because I've been thinking through for my show at CAC, which will be the one that will open after the one that comes down. Something that me and Alden think about a lot at Anna's is like on the opposite side of the large scale is the human scale. So human scale programming, human scale engagements, like the one-on-one conversations. And what perhaps in anticipation of not being able to gather in large amounts, like what does a human scale program look like? And for the artists that I'm working with at CAC, that fits more within their practice. I don't know if I would necessarily like push my interest in a human scale program onto them, but it just so happens that they also have a similar desire. So I don't know what that looks like yet, but it might be more like the program is going to be different than how we usually would do a program, in that it's perhaps more one-on-one or in very small groups, and what kind of intimacy and kinds of conversation and empathy can we create within those programs being the center, rather than can we draw a large crowd, because I don't know if that's going to be a desired effect when we reopen.
Can I also say that the thing that I think is also, like, when I'm looking at some of the ways that commercial galleries, like large commercial galleries, are handling this moment, I kind of, sometimes I'm thinking, let's do not that. Like, you know, it's like, in that sometimes there's that thing about just like, oh, and I think some of those ways there's lots of interesting stuff in there, but what you have is a group of people who need to, or you have a part of this like sort of market that needs to produce things that like this content to be taken in, to be purchased, to be like engaged with in that way. And I think the work that a lot of us are doing in this room is different. And so that thing where it's just sort of like, right, we have a virtual exhibition and we have a chat, you know, with the artist. This thing that what we're talking about actually is like, what is the purpose of having an exhibition? What's the purpose of gathering in place? What does that mean to a practice? What does that mean to the artwork, to the audience, to the artist, to the curator, to the organization, to the neighbors, to the, you know, like all of those sort of things. So I sometimes am in this moment, like looking at some of these like commercial spaces and how they're handling their thing. And I'm sort of like, yeah, something that's not that, you know, because it's just about seeing the thing, understanding that it exists in a space, and then like, and viewing it. And I think what we're, you know, talking about is like really pulling a lot more out of this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see, all of those are great points, and I totally agree. But I'm always interested in the kind of pivots that happen in these moments of crisis. I think there's a lot of disparities and inequities in access being exposed. And it's fucking tragic that it took a global pandemic for this to happen, not just in the arts, but as we know, on so many different scales and fronts. But talking about the arts in particular, I mean, I think there needs to be a real reckoning with priorities, motivations, things like funding, exhibition making, education. I mean, if institutions can cut their entire educational staff, what does that say? You know, especially at a moment when, after all of this, we will need to recultivate community and have to rethink what being in physical proximity and gathering and safety and access and all those things really mean. So that's by no means an answer to the question that you asked, Danny, but I think there's a lot of things being dredged up and brought to the fore that present themselves as things to look really hard at as an industry, as a scene, at all these different levels, and hopefully pivot towards things like equity across all fronts of access, and then all the conventional ways that we conceptualize equity and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of evolutionary potential in this moment that I hope comes to fruition, and as people who have the privilege of access to spaces, to people who make bigger decisions that we do, you know, the people who make decisions that are above our pay grade, so to speak. So being kind of instrumental in planting those seeds and hopefully allowing the senders that are coming up to kind of foment into some change down the road.
Yeah, I think you're right, Adia. In this moment is just not about solving the issue of how do we curate in a time when, you know, the traditional show doesn't happen in real life, but it's also thinking about our complicity in this moment and how can we just reorient our thinking so that we're not replicating the same problems, we're not doing the same behavior that will lead to this, and really thinking creatively about not just trying to translate something for a virtual display or translation, but really thinking about who has access and how do we cultivate those recultivate new audiences, you know, and sustain that new community, you know, which is not new, but a community that institutions have failed to engage. So yeah, that's partly what I've been thinking about sitting on my ass here by myself at home is like, you know, like how am I part of this? Not just on a human scale, meaning this, you know, what I have done as a human to contribute to the ecological disaster, but also, yeah, as a person that is in the arts, you know, and is about cultivating community. Like how can I change things? And even if I want to do things radically, it can't happen overnight. You know, there's going to be a lot of steps involved.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking, I mean, just kind of more broadly, less just specifically about curatorial work or cultural work, but in terms of these sort of like, you know, generational ruptures and the ways that those can like, you know, at their best moments, like provide an opportunity for things to change, like towards greater equity and towards like a repositioning and reprivileging of how power is functioning. And like one of the challenges of this moment is that so many of the things that like very, I don't know, in moments of clarity when I can see how it is that I would want those things to function, they all involve like people being together. And I feel like that's one of the really big challenges of this, is just sort of like all the things that I like want to be different require that kind of thing. And they are about like me wanting to like close my laptop and like not have my eyes be tired all the time from having everything come through this portal. Yeah, so it's a very kind of like bizarre thing of how many of those things are like directly in opposition to the way that we're congregating right now, right? I don't know. So they also like trying to figure out like from the curatorial side, like it's like what how to make things that are not just things that are like specific to these new sites, certainly things that engage with kind of things, also ways that where it's not sort of like part of the same sort of like ever-present drain that takes place inside of these series of rectangles, but like what are sort of non-screen based ways to experience the world, and but also in a way that's like both that it's not as private as just sort of like the fully intimate space of the book or something like that. Though I think that's a good idea, but like how do you, I don't know, I'm having a lot of trouble kind of figuring that out, and I think that there's people sort of like grappling with that. I don't think the answer is sort of like holding up your thing and being like, this is where the painting would have been. But then at the same time also like, you know, going to screenings and having that be something where you're like, this makes sense, right? This is like a video machine and we're looking at videos and being like, this is terrible. I can't watch this. I can't watch this thing that I would have somehow like traveled across town to, and now that I only have to like move 3 feet, it's impossible for me to focus on it. So like what are the types of work that actually, and practices that can make sense in this space? That's from the curatorial side more than the political side, but maybe there's some sort of relationship in there.
I think for me, I think just really quick, I just want to share, for me, it's been a lot of like what you're saying, Adia, a lot of this unveiling of like how ableist our society is, right? And so for me, I feel like I've been pretty like stagnant. I was pretty shook, went through my own thing during the beginning of this, but I've been thinking a lot about how I will change the way that I normally did things, you know, just because I've seen so much more access being tapped in through the virtual realm, you know, and even though it does get overwhelming and it is frustrating and it doesn't feel like you're in the real thing, like it is like a tool, and so I don't want to lose that either, you know. Like I think we should, like when things are like people can gather, or if ever, you know, like I still think there should be like an option to like have this as a accessible point, via virtual, via it's free, via like has audio descriptions, like whatever, you know. And so for me, it's really been a lot about unveiling that ableist like culture that we've generated, that is inherently racist, classist, sexist, and all these other things, right? And so so much to still like figure out and learn together through that. But I really hope that we don't, like once things go back to quote unquote normal, like we don't lose like that access standpoint.
Yeah. I was gonna say, and maybe it's a good way to follow up on that, is that one of the other things I've been thinking a lot about is like that kind of like this sort of access, what the tools are inside of this virtual toolbox or like this thing. And one of those things is donation models and ways of supporting the people producing content in this moment that work, that go beyond things, you know, like ways to, like I'm looking at different, you know, screenings and things that people are producing that have, you know, ways for people to also give to those content creators in that moment, so that you're not it may be free, but it being produced is not free. Like, you know, it's like, even if people are just in their homes and they're having a conversation, like that's still like this, like paying attention to that labor, and trying to think about the ways that this like kind of further sort of like just not forgetting that this labor is not invisible, and like that there's that too. So I guess there's this like also maybe other
piece of another tool that is being used by folks that like we can kind of add to our toolbox as we're curating and creating, to make sure that's also being accounted for. Something I've been thinking about a lot.
I think now is a good place to stop. It's been a long conversation and a really, really good one. I want to thank you all so much. I got a lot out of this, and it's really good to see all of you in the same room. It's my room. It's here.
Yeah, this is when we revealed we actually are all next to each other, and
right. Just like built elaborate stages for our own individual boxes.
Right. But every stage is only 5 feet by 4 feet.
So thank you all. I hope we can all go to Skylark sometime soon. And yeah, have a great weekend. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.